Now let's think about cryptocurrencies. Now, as I said, if you haven't heard of Bitcoin, you must have been sleeping under a rock. So one of the things that you may have heard about is also the volatility of the prices of cryptocurrencies. Let's look at the graphs just so you understand the magnitude of things. So here's a graph of the euro versus US dollar exchange rate. And I'm using the US dollar because it's easiest to get the data, and I just pulled it from Yahoo Finance because the details are not super important. The bigger picture is important here. And as you can see, this exchange rate also fluctuates a fair bit, right? So at some point it was close to 1-to-1, then it went down to 0.7. So for every euro you only needed to, so for every US dollar you only needed to pay 0.70 euros. And you can see there's a fair amount of fluctuation in these currency rates. This is a 5-year horizon. So it's not like currencies as a whole relative to another currency do not fluctuate. They do, right? We all know that. But now let's look at this picture here, which is Bitcoin. So you can see Bitcoin had very, very little value. And there is an example where the first transaction in Bitcoin was for, I think it was 500,000 Bitcoins that were, or 100,000, I'm not 100% sure, but a very large amount of Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. And you can see the price for Bitcoin was very low. As in this graph, which is 5 years old, it was about $2,000, which is already pretty high. But then when it went up almost to, in December 2017, went almost up to $20,000. And then it dropped dramatically, and it fluctuates around, it's now at around $10,000 per Bitcoin. Just as a fun story, when the whole craze went on in 2017, there were very few people who actually had any credibility and have thought about Bitcoin seriously. So I was called upon for TV and radio interviews at that time quite regularly. And one interview that I gave, I was called in the morning. The price of Bitcoin at that point was, I think, 12,000, 13,000. I drove over, I checked on my phone, the price was, when I met the producer of the show, the price was about 15,000. And then I walked up the stairs, and by the time I was ready to be on air, the price had already gone to $18,000. So it was a crazy time, and the prices were absolutely exploding, and nobody could really explain why. Now, if you watch the video, you can also see the headline of the video is that U of T professor says that Bitcoin is fundamentally flawed. I'll explain why I mean that in a minute. Anyway, but this is the price of Bitcoin. Now, in relative terms, there is also something which is much more extreme, which is Ether. It's been around for longer, but if you look at the price of Ether here, it went all the way from essentially pennies to, and Ether was something which only conceived in 2014, and I think it was released in 2015, and the price for Ether was minuscule, was pennies, right? And at some point it went all the way up to $1,200 per Ether. Now it dropped down, and by now it's around $400 per Ether, so it's still a very substantial price appreciation compared to the pennies where they started with, and many people became millionaires and all that in the meantime. So anyway, let's take about all of this away, but you can see that there's a very large amount of fluctuation. Now, if you just look at the graph and you see variation, you go, well, one is as volatile as the other. But just to put all three in perspective, you have Bitcoin, Ether, and the US dollar to euro exchange rate, and you can see the very large magnitude of the changes in relative terms. So now, where I'm getting with this, what am I trying to say? Well, I want to say that as a store of value, this is not a very good idea, right? Because if you bought Ether at $1,200 US dollars per Ether, and you're now at 400, you lost a lot of money, right? Is it a good unit of account? Well, a good unit of account means that I can take particular goods and measure them in that amount. And again, that is something which is not really happening because, well, nothing is really measured in Ether or in Bitcoin these days. Now, can we at least use it as a method of exchange? Well, again, this is also something which I would argue is not very useful, because if the value of a coin changes very dramatically, would you as a merchant accept it? I don't think so. So as you can see, as money, cryptocurrencies, or as a replacement for our current money, cryptocurrencies are not very useful. And one thing I've not even mentioned at this point is the amount of transactions that you can actually process. Now, I will pull up at some later point, I'm going to pull up some graphs on this one or some statistics. But the basic fact is this. So Bitcoin can process by technological limitations about only 7 transactions a minute. a second. Ether can do more because of the way it's structured, so it can actually process 30 transactions a second. But these are tiny amounts, right? Now, in order to replace just the Canadian retail transactions, you need a transaction throughput of about 600 a second, just to do the Canadian ones, the ones that Payments Canada processes. If you want to go to, if you compare this to, for instance, Visa has worldwide transaction capability of, I think, 12,000 a second. Now, I should say that there are blockchain networks that can process more. So there is, for instance, Conflux, a Chinese company. They can process around 3,500 a second. And then there is Ava, which is built on a proof of stake mechanism built on Ethereum, or it's called also Ethereum. They claim to be able to process about 5,000 per second. So there are networks that can process more, and there's other workarounds that you have. But my basic point is that both Ethereum and Bitcoin at this point do not have the capability to actually process enough. Come to that later in more detail. So, in other words, to summarize this up, cryptocurrencies are currently useless as money. All right, now, next question is there something that can be done about this? So the volatility is a problem. But maybe we like the technology, because what it really is that we have programmable money. And again, this takes Bitcoin out of the equation, because Bitcoin is really hard to program. But Ether, for instance, programmable money. So you can have execution of code to facilitate value transfers. Now, here's the problem. And there's still some fundamental problems that people haven't solved, but I cannot use cryptocurrencies as money, and I can't use real money on a blockchain as it is, right? Because we just can't. Well, what can we do about that? Well, there is a solution, which is stablecoins, number one. And the second is central bank issued money. So what a stablecoin is, essentially is a private entity creates a new token, which is particularly fixed exchange rate to fiat currency. And when we talk about US dollars, Canadian dollars, this is referred to usually as fiat money. Fiat coming from the Latin word which says, so be it, right? It basically means that somebody says, in this case for fiat money, usually a government says, this is what it is, right? This is what this money stands for. And usually the way to think about it is that the Canadian dollar coin that you have is the equivalent of, $1 is of $1 in taxes that you owe the government. All right, so now, but a stable coin is essentially a token which is issued on a blockchain, and the alternative, of course, would be that the central bank issued money on a blockchain or in some other digital form. And we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the difference between these later in the course, except for the fintech course. In the fintech course, we're just alluding to this generally speaking. Now, let's talk about stablecoins for 1 minute. There's essentially 3 different types. There are collateral-backed ones, and there are algorithmic ones. And among the collateral ones, there are those that are traditional. They're based basically on existing assets, real-world assets like gold or fiat currencies. And there are those that are backed by cryptocurrencies, so like Bitcoin and Ether. The ones backed by cryptocurrencies, you may say, well, why do we have a stablecoin which is backed by a cryptocurrency which is very volatile? How could this possibly work? Well, the way it works is essentially to over-collateralize. So for every US dollar that you want to receive as a stable coin, you need to back it by the equivalent of $2 to $3 worth of cryptocurrency, so that there's some security that when you want to revert the stable coin and convert it into something else, there's enough to back it. There's also the algorithmic ones, which are usually fee-backed and Sainorash-backed and so on. I'm going to be very honest. I've read a number of white papers and explanations of these. I have not understood them. I think this is voodoo, right? So just we're clear about this, but they exist. So we may want to think about this and talk about this at some point. I collected some data a while ago, I think in late 2018, early 2019. And these projects are backed often by quite a lot of money, with the idea being, of course, that these stable coins can eventually be used for something something useful. Now, these amounts that are there look very tiny, but over time and over the last few months, an enormous amount of real money has gone into these stable coins so as to facilitate transactions on the blockchain. So we'll get to that. All right, now the one thing I should talk about, and I will also dedicate probably half lecture or so, is Libra. Now, what is Libra? Libra is the idea of something which was is a consortium put together, or the Libra Association is a consortium put together by Facebook. The idea is essentially that this consortium gets together to use its expertise to build a new financial infrastructure, and this is essentially what Facebook went out to. The consortium consisted, of course, of Facebook, which took a lead role, but also it had at the early stages MasterCard, Stripe, Visa behind it. Now they have eventually dropped out, and we can talk about the details of why that happened. But the idea was essentially, the very early idea, which was a great idea, is that each Libra coin would be backed by a basket of currencies. And so the basket would be, consisting of the US dollar, the euro, the yen, the British pound, and the Chinese yuan, or the RMB, which is the external way to think about the currency. So that was basically what they had in mind to create this super currency. It's not a new idea. Effectively, there is something called a special drawing right, which is, an asset issued by the IMF, when we talk about Libra in detail, we can talk about what that means more. But the basic idea is that basically that you have a token which represents a mix of currencies. Now, if you take a step back and think about what that does for commerce, for international commerce, that's obviously great. So for people in countries that don't have a stable currency, and there are many of this world, this could be a real bonus. This could really help them along. Whereas, of course, for countries like the US and Europe, they worry that if this money, the Libra coin, would become the de facto means of exchange, then as a currency zone, you may lose monetary policy tools at your disposal. And so that is, of course, a public policy concern. Now, but the question before we start with this, right? So this all was predicated on being issued by Facebook, or Facebook was really the face of the whole thing. And so there's a real question of whether people would actually want to use it, right? So instead of thinking about what the regulators want and what politicians want and what government officials want, there's a real question of whether or not consumers would actually use it. So in order to figure this out, I teamed up, and I mean really me, I teamed up with a local survey firm. They did something really clever. So they have the ability to run online surveys across different countries. And so we ran a survey which was for the US, for India, and for Nigeria. Why? Well, because these are all quite representative countries of the respective zones where they're from. And so we asked the question of, would you use Libra as money, would you use it? And the answer was actually quite positive, right? So now it depends on which country you're looking at. In the US, the answer was very different from Nigeria. So in the US, only about 30% of people said that they would use money issued by Facebook or by a tech company. Whereas in Nigeria, the number of people was much higher, was 65, 70%. Now, if we ask explicitly if we compare what the answers that we get for Facebook versus a tech firm, and this is where you can see why Facebook is important, the answers were starkly different. So if we just use the term general tech firm, the acceptance rate was much higher, right? Whereas if you have Facebook's name on there, then there was a huge backlash against it. So very few people. So it's about a percentage difference of about 15 percentage points of whether people would use it or definitely would not use it. So in other words, having Facebook's name on there was not a beneficial thing for Libra. And by now also the proposal of Libra has changed dramatically again. So by now what the Libra Association will do is they will issue coins by individual countries. They will issue a Libra coin, US dollar, Libra coin, British pound, and so on and so forth. So as to keep the regulators happy and to make them believe that they continue to be able to use their monetary policy, which effectively they would be.